When people think about Starbucks, they often reduce it to a logo, a cup, or a daily habit that feels almost automatic. But Starbucks did not become a global phenomenon by selling coffee alone. Coffee is everywhere, easy to copy, and culturally ancient. What Starbucks truly built was not a beverage company, but a ritual, a space, and a psychological contract with millions of people who were not just buying caffeine, but buying a moment of belonging in an increasingly hurried and fragmented world. The journey from a small coffee bean retailer in Seattle to a brand embedded in daily life across continents is a story about culture timing and the deliberate creation of meaning where none previously existed. Starbucks began in 1971 as a modest shop selling high-quality coffee beans and equipment inspired by a reverence for the craft rather than a vision of mass consumption. The founders were purists. They cared about sourcing, roasting, and educating customers about coffee as an artisanal product. At this stage, Starbucks was not a cafe, not a lifestyle, and certainly not a global brand. It was a specialty retailer for enthusiasts. The transformation came later, not from the product itself, but from a shift in perspective about what coffee could represent in everyday life. That shift arrived with Howard Schultz. When Schultz joined Starbucks in the early 1980s, his defining insight was not operational, but cultural. On a trip to Italy, he observed espresso bars functioning as social anchors. Italians did not just drink coffee, they gathered around it. Cafes were places of conversation, routine, and identity woven into the rhythm of daily life. Schultz realized that America lacked an equivalent third place, a space that was neither home nor work, where people could pause without explanation. Starbucks' future would be built not on beans, but on this missing space. Implementing this idea required courage, because it meant abandoning the comfort of being a niche retailer and embracing the complexity of hospitality. Starbucks began serving drinks, training baristas, designing seating, and shaping atmosphere. Music, lighting, smell, and language all became intentional. Ordering coffee became a small performance, complete with personalized names and customized drinks. This personalization mattered. It transformed a commodity into an experience. You were not just buying coffee. You were being recognized, however briefly, in a crowded world. From the beginning of its cafe expansion, Starbucks understood the power of consistency. A Starbucks in Seattle needed to feel like a Starbucks in Tokyo, London, or Sao Paulo, while still absorbing local nuances. This balance between global sameness and local sensitivity became one of the brand's great strengths. Wherever you traveled, Starbucks offered familiarity. In unfamiliar cities, that familiarity reduced friction and anxiety. It became a safe harbor for travelers, students, freelancers, and professionals alike. Consistency in this context was not boring. It was reassuring. Starbucks' pricing strategy reinforced this positioning. The company charged more than traditional coffee shops, not because the cost demanded it, but because the experience justified it. Customers were paying for time, comfort, Wi-Fi, and social permission to linger. This reframed coffee from a quick transaction into a small luxury accessible to many. Unlike high-end dining, Starbucks' indulgence was repeatable. It could be woven into daily routines, which made the brand feel intimate rather than exclusive. Growth accelerated rapidly, and with it came a critical strategic decision: Starbucks would own and operate its stores rather than franchise most of them. This choice limited speed in the short term, but protected culture in the long term. By controlling training, store design, and employee experience, Starbucks ensured that the brand promise was delivered consistently. Baristas were not just workers, they were partners. Benefits, stock options, and language were used deliberately to create internal alignment. Starbucks believed correctly that a company selling warmth and connection could not treat its frontline employees as disposable. As Starbucks expanded globally, it also expanded symbolically. The brand became associated with modern urban life creativity and aspiration. Students studied there, writers wrote there, meetings happened there. Starbucks positioned itself as a neutral ground where ambition and pause could coexist. This positioning was subtle but powerful. Starbucks was not selling escape like a bar or productivity like an office. It was selling the space in between where identity could breathe. At its peak, Starbucks seemed unstoppable. Store counts grew, revenues soared, and the brand became synonymous with coffee itself in many markets. Yet this very success introduced new risks. Rapid expansion threatened intimacy. Standardization risked becoming sterility. Convenience risked eroding craft. These tensions were not immediately visible, but they were accumulating beneath the surface. Because when a brand is built on atmosphere and meaning rather than necessity, dilution is far more dangerous than competition. And it is precisely at this point that the deeper question of Starbucks' story begins to emerge. Because once a company scales a feeling rather than a function, it must confront whether that feeling can survive replication at global scale, or whether growth inevitably drains the very authenticity that made the experience special in the first place. And that unresolved tension is the unfinished thought we must now carry forward into the next part. And when this unresolved tension is carried into Starbucks' period of hyper-expansion, the brand encounters its most delicate challenge, because scaling a feeling is fundamentally different from scaling a product. And the very systems that make growth possible can quietly erode the intimacy that made the experience meaningful. By the mid-2000s, Starbucks was everywhere. Stores appeared on opposite sides of the same street, inside bookstores, airports, hospitals, and supermarkets. Convenience increased, but scarcity disappeared. What was once a deliberate pause began to feel automatic, and automatic rituals risked becoming empty. The first signs of strain were subtle. Stores became louder, faster, more transactional. Machines replaced some of the sensory theater of coffee making. Baristas had less time to connect as efficiency metrics tightened. The smell of coffee, once a defining feature, faded in some locations as food and merchandising expanded. None of these changes were catastrophic on their own, but together they signaled drift. Starbucks had not lost customers, it had risked losing meaning. When a brand is built on atmosphere, small erosions compound quickly. The 2008 financial crisis forced a reckoning. As economic pressure mounted, Starbucks faced declining traffic and a questioning of its premium positioning. This moment revealed the difference between a company that sells a habit and one that sells a relationship. Howard Schultz returned as CEO not to introduce a new product, but to restore focus. Thousands of stores were closed. Expansion slowed. Training was re-emphasized. Even stores were temporarily shut down, so baristas could relearn the craft of making espresso. This was not nostalgia. It was brand surgery. Starbucks recognized that efficiency without soul would eventually hollow it out. What followed was a period of recalibration rather than retreat. Starbucks did not abandon growth, but it reframed it. The concept of the third place was updated for a digital age. Mobile ordering, loyalty programs, and personalization through data were introduced, but with care. Technology was positioned as a convenience layer, not the core experience. The challenge was to integrate speed without eliminating presence. Starbucks aimed to let customers choose their level of engagement. Linger or leave Connect, or remain anonymous without breaking the brand's emotional promise. Global markets added further complexity. In some cultures, Starbucks functioned less as a cafe and more as a symbol of modernity or status. In others, it adapted to local tastes, layouts, and rituals. The brand learned that authenticity at scale does not mean uniformity. It means coherence. Starbucks could feel different in Shanghai or Milan, but it had to feel intentional everywhere. This required deep cultural listening, not just operational replication. The brand's ability to localize without fragmenting became one of its quiet strengths. Starbucks also confronted new questions about responsibility. As a ubiquitous presence, it could no longer position itself as a neutral backdrop. Environmental impact, ethical sourcing, and labor practices moved from supporting narratives to central expectations. Starbucks responded by emphasizing fair trade sustainability initiatives and employee benefits, not as marketing add-ons, but as extensions of its original philosophy. A brand that sold care and comfort could not credibly ignore the conditions under which its coffee was grown or served. Responsibility became part of the experience, whether customers consciously noticed it or not. Over time, Starbucks's evolution revealed a deeper lesson about brand longevity. The goal was never to preserve a frozen version of the past, but to protect the reason people cared in the first place. Starbucks learned that the third place is not defined by furniture, music, or menus. It is defined by permission. Permission to slow down. Permission to exist between obligations. Permission to be alone together. As long as Starbucks could deliver that permission, the specifics could change. In the end, Starbucks' journey from coffee bean to global phenomenon shows that the most powerful brands are not those that avoid tension, but those that manage it consciously. Growth versus intimacy. Efficiency versus warmth. Consistency versus local meaning. Starbucks did not solve these tensions once. It revisited them repeatedly, accepting that cultural relevance is not a destination, but a practice. And this is the enduring insight of the Starbucks story. When a company builds its success on human emotion, rather than pure necessity, its greatest asset is not scale, but sensitivity. The ability to notice when growth begins to crowd out meaning, and the courage to pause, correct, and recommit to what made the brand matter in the first place. Starbucks remains a global phenomenon, not because it sells coffee, but because it continues to negotiate imperfectly, but intentionally, the fragile space between commerce and comfort, where modern life still needs somewhere to sit, breathe, and belong.